Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to see in a courtroom. She was just an ordinary woman with a big heart and a strong sense of right and wrong. For years, she had been the go-to person in her community when someone needed help. Whether it was standing up for a neighbor being treated unfairly or organizing food drives for struggling families, people trusted her because she always put others first. But this time, Karoline wasn't fighting for someone else. She was fighting for herself, or more accurately, for the memory of her late grandmother. It all started with a simple disagreement over a piece of land, a patch of earth that had been in her family for generations. Her grandmother had cherished it, planting flowers along its edges and telling stories about how her own parents had worked hard to buy it. After her grandmother passed away, Karoline assumed the land would stay in the family as her grandmother had wished. But one day, she received a letter from a lawyer claiming that someone else now owned the property. The new owner argued that old records showed they had purchased it decades ago, even though Karoline's family had never sold it. At first, Karoline thought it was a misunderstanding. She gathered every document she could find, old deeds, letters, and photographs, to prove the land belonged to her family. But when she tried to reason with the other party, they refused to listen. Instead, they took the matter to court, leaving Karoline no choice but to fight back. That's how she ended up sitting nervously in a courtroom, surrounded by people whispering and shuffling papers. The room felt cold and intimidating, especially with Judge Harold McAllister presiding over the case. He was known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude. Some said he didn't have much patience for those who weren't trained lawyers. As he walked into the room, his robe flowing behind him, Karoline couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about honoring her grandmother's legacy. When the judge called the courtroom to order, Karoline reminded herself why she was there. She wasn't doing this for fame or money. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. Still, as she glanced at the opposing side, a team of well-dressed attorneys armed with stacks of documents, she wondered if she stood any chance at all. Little did she know this trial would turn out to be far more than she ever imagined. It wouldn't just test her courage, but also reveal strength she didn't know she had. And it all began with a single moment that would change everything. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath as the trial began. The opposing side, represented by a slick and confident lawyer, wasted no time laying out their case. They presented stacks of documents, maps, deeds, and records that supposedly proved the land had been legally sold decades ago. Their argument was clear and polished. Karoline's family hadn't owned the property for years, and her claim was based on nothing more than sentimentality. When it was Karoline's turn to speak, she stood up slowly, clutching her notes tightly in her hands. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. She took a deep breath and began explaining her side of the story. She talked about her grandmother, the woman who had poured her soul into that land, planting trees, tending to flowers, and sharing stories under the shade of an old oak tree. Karoline described how her grandmother had always spoken about passing the land down to future generations, making it a place where family could gather and create memories. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of interest in Judge McAllister's eyes. But then, just as she finished her statement, something happened that made her blood run cold. The judge leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and let out a loud chuckle. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made you feel small, like you'd just told a joke that didn't land. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "do you really think what shall we call your passion project here can stand up against actual legal documentation?" He gestured toward the mountain of papers on the other side of the room. "This is a court of law, not a family reunion." The words hit Karoline like a punch to the gut. She felt her face flush with embarrassment, but she refused to look down. Instead, she locked eyes with the judge, her jaw tightening. She knew he was mocking her, trying to intimidate her into backing down, but she also knew something else. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her grandmother, her family's history, and the countless others who might find themselves in a similar situation someday. Forcing herself to stay calm, Karoline nodded respectfully. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I understand this is a serious matter and I respect the process. But sometimes the truth isn't written on paper, it's carried in people's hearts, and my grandmother's heart was tied to that land." The courtroom fell silent after her words, but the judge didn't seem moved. If anything, his smirk deepened. "We'll see about that," he said dismissively, before moving on to the next phase of the trial. As Karoline sat back down, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The opposing lawyer shot her a smug grin, clearly thinking the case was already won. Even some of the spectators exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. To them, it probably seemed like Karoline didn't stand a chance. But deep down, Karoline knew she couldn't give up. Not yet. That laugh from the judge, as humiliating as it was, lit a fire inside her. It reminded her why she was fighting in the first place. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about proving that sometimes, the things that matter most can't be measured in dollars or documented in ledgers. Her grandmother's love for that land was real, and Karoline was determined to make sure the court understood that. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. What followed would test her resolve, challenge her beliefs, and ultimately reveal strengths she never knew she had. The trial moved forward, and the opposing side continued to pile on evidence. Their lawyer called witness after witness, surveyors, historians, even a retired government official, all of whom testified that the land in question had been legally transferred decades ago. Each statement felt like another brick being added to a wall that seemed impossible to climb. Karoline listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to find cracks in their arguments. But for every point they made, there was a document, a signature, or a date backing it up. It was overwhelming. Karoline's frustration grew with each passing minute. She couldn't help but glance at the judge, hoping to see some sign of doubt or hesitation in his expression. But Judge McAllister sat there, stone-faced and unimpressed, nodding occasionally as if everything the other side said made perfect sense. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Karoline could feel the tide turning against her. People were starting to believe the story the other side was telling, one built on paperwork and technicalities. Then, during a short recess, something unexpected happened. As Karoline stepped outside the courtroom to clear her head, an older man approached her. He looked like he'd seen a lot of life. His hands were calloused, his face lined with wrinkles, but his eyes sparkled with kindness. "Excuse me," he said softly, tipping his hat slightly. "Are you the one fighting for that piece of land?" Karoline nodded, unsure of where this conversation was headed. The man smiled faintly and introduced himself. "I used to work around those parts years ago," he explained. "I was a surveyor back in the day. Knew your grandmother well. She was a good woman. Always offered me a glass of lemonade when I came by to check the property lines." Karoline's heart skipped a beat. "You knew my grandmother?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of surprise and hope. The man nodded. "Oh, yes. She loved that land more than anything. Used to tell me stories about how her parents worked 2 jobs just to buy it. Said it was her dream to keep it in the family forever." He paused, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowed map. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "This is from one of my surveys. It shows the exact boundaries of your grandmother's property. Thought you might need it." Karoline stared at the map, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. It was old, but meticulously detailed, with handwritten notes marking specific landmarks. Her throat tightened as she realized what this could mean. This wasn't just any map. It was proof that her grandmother's land hadn't been sold or divided. It was still hers, just as she had always claimed. "Thank you," Karoline whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." The man patted her shoulder gently. "Good luck in there," he said before walking away. Karoline stood frozen for a moment, clutching the map like it was a lifeline. For the first time since the trial began, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. Back inside the courtroom, Karoline waited anxiously for her turn to present new evidence. When the judge finally called on her, she stood up slowly, holding the map tightly in her hands. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface, "I'd like to submit this as additional evidence." The opposing lawyer immediately objected, calling the map irrelevant and outdated. But Judge McAllister raised a hand to silence him. Leaning forward slightly, he studied the map with evident curiosity. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone sharper than before but not entirely dismissive. Karoline took a deep breath. "It was given to me by a retired surveyor who personally mapped the property while my grandmother owned it. It clearly shows the original boundaries of the land, which matched the description my grandmother left behind." The judge frowned, his earlier smugness fading into something closer to intrigue. After a long pause, he allowed the map to be entered into evidence, much to the dismay of the opposing counsel. Though the battle was far from over, Karoline felt a small victory in that moment. For the first time, the court was paying attention, not just to the papers and records, but to the human story behind them. As the session ended for the day, Karoline packed up her things, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going down without a fight. And somewhere, she hoped her grandmother was watching, proud of how hard she was trying to protect the land they both loved. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet tension that hadn't been there before. Karoline could feel it as she took her seat, clutching the map the retired surveyor had given her. The opposing lawyer seemed more on edge too, his confident smirk replaced by a slight frown. Even Judge McAllister appeared more alert, his usual aloofness giving way to something closer to curiosity. When the proceedings resumed, the opposing side tried to regain control of the narrative. Their lawyer launched into a passionate argument, emphasizing the importance of legal records over sentimental attachments. He waved around documents and cited laws, his voice rising with every sentence. "Your Honor," he said dramatically, "this case is about facts, not feelings. The law is clear. Ownership is determined by official records, not hearsay or old maps." Karoline listened carefully, her mind working overtime. She knew the lawyer was trying to paint her as someone clinging to emotions rather than evidence. But she also knew that wasn't true. Her case wasn't just about sentiment, it was about truth. And now, thanks to the map and the stories she'd gathered, she had more than just her grandmother's memory to rely on. When it was her turn to speak, Karoline stood up slowly, her heart pounding but her resolve stronger than ever. She began by acknowledging the other side's points. "I understand the importance of legal documents," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But sometimes those documents don't tell the whole story. Sometimes they miss the human element. The people who lived and worked and loved the land we're talking about." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "My grandmother didn't just own that land, she built a life on it. She planted trees, cared for it, and passed down her love for it to me. And yes, I have proof, not just in this map, but in letters she wrote and stories people still remember. These aren't just feelings. They're part of the history of that land." As she spoke, Karoline noticed something remarkable happening. The judge, who had initially dismissed her, was leaning forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Some of the spectators exchanged glances, whispering quietly among themselves. Even the opposing lawyer looked uneasy, shifting in his seat as if sensing that the tide might be turning. To drive her point home, Karoline pulled out another piece of evidence, a letter written by her grandmother decades ago. In it, her grandmother described the exact boundaries of the property and expressed her wish to keep it in the family. Karoline read excerpts aloud, her voice trembling with emotion but steady enough to carry across the room. "When I look at these fields," she read, "I see my parents' hard work. I see my children playing under the oak tree, and I pray that someday their children will do the same. This land isn't just dirt and grass. It's our legacy." By the time she Finished reading, the courtroom was silent. You could almost hear a pin drop. For a moment, it felt like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The opposing lawyer tried to counter her argument, calling the letter irrelevant and accusing Karoline of relying on anecdotal nonsense. But his words lacked the confidence they'd had earlier. It was as if he sensed that the ground beneath him was starting to shift. Judge McAllister, however, didn't react immediately. Instead, he sat back in his chair, tapping, his pen lightly against the desk. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, or maybe even admiration. Whatever it was, Karoline felt a spark of hope ignite within her. For the first time since the trial began, she realized she wasn't fighting alone. She had her grandmother's spirit guiding her, the support of the community behind her, and the undeniable power of truth on her side. The battle was far from over, but Karoline knew one thing for certain. She had found her voice, and no amount of intimidation or mockery could silence it now. As the trial entered its final stages, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. The opposing lawyer, sensing that the case might not be as clear-cut as he'd originally thought, decided to go on the offensive. He requested permission to cross-examine Karoline, hoping to rattle her and expose any weaknesses in her argument. Judge McAllister granted it with a nod, and the lawyer wasted no time diving in. "Miss Leavitt," he began, his tone sharp and condescending, "you've presented a map and a letter as evidence. But can you explain how these items hold up against official records? Surely you understand that courts operate on facts, not nostalgia." Karoline took a deep breath, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I do understand that, yes," she replied calmly. "But I also believe that facts aren't limited to documents stamped by a government office. Facts are truths, things that actually happened. And the truth is my grandmother owned that land, cared for it, and never sold it." The lawyer smirked, clearly thinking he had her cornered. "So you're saying your grandmother's word, a woman who isn't even here to testify, is more reliable than decades of legal documentation?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "I'm saying that my grandmother's actions speak louder than any piece of paper. She lived on that land, worked on it, and passed it down through our family. Those aren't just words, they're part of history. And if we ignore history, we lose sight of what really matters." Her response caught the lawyer off guard, but he quickly recovered, launching into a series of rapid-fire questions. "Then, tell me this. Why should we trust an old map or a handwritten letter when there's no way to verify their authenticity? How do we know they weren't created recently to support your claim?" Karoline smiled faintly, unfazed by his aggression. "Because they were given to me by people who knew my grandmother personally. People like the surveyor who mapped the property and saw her dedication firsthand. These aren't random pieces of paper. They're pieces of a story that has been shared and remembered by real people." The lawyer opened his mouth to argue further, but before he could say anything, Judge McAllister interrupted. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Miss Leavitt, let me ask you something. Do you truly believe that emotional attachment outweighs legal precedent?" For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. All eyes turned to Karoline, waiting for her answer. She straightened her posture, her voice steady and clear. "No, Your Honor, I don't believe emotion outweighs the law, but I do believe the law exists to protect people, not just property. My grandmother followed every rule, paid every tax, and respected every boundary. If the system fails to recognize that, then maybe it's the system that needs rethinking." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a few seconds, no one moved or spoke. Even the judge seemed taken aback, his stern expression softening slightly. It was as if Karoline had struck a chord, not just with him, but with everyone in the room. The opposing lawyer tried to regain control, firing off another question. "Are you suggesting that personal stories should override established laws?" Karoline shook her head. "Not at all. I'm suggesting that the two can coexist. Laws are meant to serve justice, and justice isn't blind. It sees people, their struggles, and their dreams. My grandmother's dream was to keep that land in our family. Isn't it worth considering whether that dream aligns with the truth?" The bull. Lawyer looked frustrated, pacing back and forth as if searching for a comeback. But nothing he said seemed to carry the same weight anymore. The momentum had shifted, and it was obvious to everyone in the room, including him. Judge McAllister leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His earlier skepticism had given way to something else, curiosity, perhaps even respect. "Miss Leavitt," he said slowly, "you certainly have a way with words. Let's see where this goes." The cross-examination ended shortly after, leaving the courtroom buzzing with quiet murmurs. People glanced at each other, some nodding approvingly, others whispering about how unexpectedly compelling Karoline's defense had been. As she returned to her seat, Karoline felt a surge of relief and determination. She hadn't won yet, but she could feel the walls closing in on the other side. Whatever happened next, she knew she had fought with everything she had. And somewhere, deep inside, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. The courtroom was quieter than it had been all week as the trial moved toward its closing arguments. Everyone could feel that the end was near, but no one knew exactly how things would turn out. The opposing lawyer went first, delivering a polished and confident speech. He spoke about the importance of following rules, sticking to facts, and respecting legal systems. "This case," he said firmly, pointing at Karoline, "isn't about sentiment or family history. It's about upholding the law, the foundation of our society." His words were sharp and well-rehearsed, but they lacked heart. Even some of the spectators exchanged skeptical glances, as if sensing that his argument felt hollow compared to the deeply personal story Karoline had shared. Still, when he finished speaking, there was a murmur of approval from his side of the room. They believed they had done enough to secure a win. Then it was Karoline's turn. She stood up slowly, her hands steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. For a moment, she looked around the courtroom, at the judge, the lawyers, the people watching, and took a deep breath. This wasn't just her moment. It was her grandmother's too. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "I respect the law. I truly do. But laws exist for a reason, to protect fairness, honesty, and justice. And sometimes justice isn't found in papers or signatures. Sometimes it's found in stories, memories, and the values we pass down through generations." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "My grandmother didn't leave behind a fortune or a famous name. What she left behind was love, for her family, for her community, and for the land she worked so hard to care for. That land wasn't just dirt under her feet. It was part of who she was. And when she passed away, she trusted me to honor her legacy by protecting it." Karoline's voice grew stronger as she spoke, each word carrying the weight of everything she'd fought for. "Yes, the other side has documents, old deeds, maps, records. But those documents don't tell the full story. They don't show the hours my grandmother spent planting trees or the laughter of children playing in the fields. They don't capture the tears she shed when she thought about leaving the land to us someday." She held up the map again along with the letter her grandmother had written. "These aren't just pieces of evidence. They're reminders of what really matters. The human connection to the places we call home. My grandmother followed every rule, paid every fee, and respected every boundary. If we let paperwork erase her story, then we're saying that numbers on a page are more important than the lives lived on that land." By now, the entire courtroom was silent. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on her every word. Even Judge McAllister seemed captivated, his usual stern expression replaced by something closer to reflection. Karoline wasn't just making an argument anymore. She was painting a picture, reminding everyone of why the case mattered beyond the courtroom walls. Her final sentence landed like a hammer striking stone. "So today, Your Honor, I'm asking you to see this case not as a battle over property lines, but as a chance to honor someone who gave everything she had to preserve something meaningful. Because justice isn't just about laws, it's about doing what's right." When she sat back down, the room stayed quiet for several seconds. Then, almost imperceptibly, a few people began to clap. Not loudly, but enough to break the tension. Quickly realizing where they were, they stopped, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. The opposing lawyer looked uneasy, flipping through his notes as if searching for something to say that could match the power of Karoline's words, but nothing came. Judge McAllister cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Thank you, Miss Leavitt," he said simply, his tone measured but tinged with something new, respect, perhaps even admiration. He glanced at the clock, then announced that he would deliver his verdict after a short recess. As the gavel sounded, the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. People gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd just witnessed. Some praised Karoline's courage. Others wondered aloud if the judge might actually rule in her favor. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited anxiously, eager to hear how the dramatic showdown had unfolded. When Karoline stepped out for a quick break, she was bombarded with questions. "How does it feel to face such a tough opponent?" one asked. "Do you think you'll win?" another pressed. But Karoline only smiled faintly, shaking her head. "It's not about winning or losing," she said softly. "It's about standing up for what's right. Whatever happens next, I know I gave it my all." As she returned to the courtroom, her heart raced with anticipation. She didn't know what the judge would decide, but she did know one thing. She had already won in a way that couldn't be taken away. She had stood tall, spoken her truth, and reminded everyone in that room, including herself, that justice isn't just about cold, hard facts. It's about humanity, heart, and the stories that bind us together. The courtroom was packed when Judge McAllister returned to deliver his verdict. Every seat was filled, and even the aisles had people standing quietly, eager to hear what he would say. The air felt heavy with anticipation, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Karoline sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart was pounding so loudly, she wondered if the judge could hear it too. Judge McAllister took his time getting settled, shuffling through papers on his desk as if prolonging the suspense. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable, a mix of seriousness and something else that no one could quite place. Clearing his throat, he began to speak. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented in this case," he said slowly, his voice echoing through the silent room, "I find myself faced with a decision that goes beyond mere legalities. This is not just a dispute over property, it's a question of legacy, integrity, and the stories that shape us." Karoline's chest tightened. His words sounded thoughtful, almost reflective, but she couldn't tell yet which way he was leaning. The opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that this wasn't going to be a straightforward ruling. "The law exists to serve justice," the judge continued, "but justice isn't blind. It sees people, their struggles, their dreams, and their humanity. In this case, we have two sides presenting compelling arguments. On one hand, we have decades-old documents and technical claims. On the other, we have a deeply personal story backed by tangible evidence. A map, a letter, and the memories of those who knew the land and its owner." He paused, glancing briefly at Karoline before turning his gaze toward the opposing counsel. "It is easy to rely solely on paperwork, to believe that numbers and signatures are all that matter. But sometimes the truth lies elsewhere, in the lives lived, the values upheld, and the promises kept." For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. Then Judge McAllister leaned forward slightly, his tone firm but compassionate. "In light of the evidence provided, and after considering the broader implications of this case, I rule in favor of Miss Leavitt. The land in question shall remain with her family, as per the wishes of her late grandmother." The words hit like a thunderclap. For a split second there was complete silence. Then the courtroom erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, cheering and clapping as if they'd been waiting years for this moment. Karoline sat frozen, in her chair, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't expected this, not really. All she'd wanted was to honor her grandmother's memory, to fight for what she believed was right. And now, here she was, victorious. As the noise settled, Judge McAllister raised a hand to quiet the room. "Let this be a reminder," he added, addressing everyone present, "that while laws guide us, it is our humanity that defines us. Justice must always strive to reflect both." Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed Karoline, firing questions left and right. "How does it feel to win?" one asked. "What message do you want to send to others in similar situations?" Another chimed in. Overwhelmed but smiling through her tears, Karoline simply said, "This isn't about me. It's about my grandmother and the love she had for that land. I hope this gives hope to anyone fighting for what they believe in, because sometimes standing up for what's right can make all the difference." Word of the trial spread quickly, inspiring countless people who heard about it. Karoline became a symbol of resilience, proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to back down. As for Judge McAllister, he later admitted in an interview that Karoline's determination had changed his perspective. "Sometimes," he said, "you meet someone who reminds you why the law exists in the first place, to protect what truly matters." And so Karoline walked away from the courthouse that day with more than just a piece of land. She carried a renewed sense of purpose, a strengthened belief in justice, and the knowledge that her grandmother's legacy would live on, not just in the fields and trees, but in the hearts of everyone who heard her story. The days following the trial were a whirlwind for Karoline. News of her victory spread like wildfire, not just locally but across the country. People everywhere were captivated by her story, a regular person taking on a powerful opponent and winning against all odds. Reporters called nonstop, wanting to interview her. Social media buzzed with posts about her courage and determination. Strangers sent messages of support, sharing their own stories of fighting for what they believed in. It was overwhelming, but also deeply humbling. Karoline didn't let the attention go to her head. Instead, she used it as an opportunity to shine a light on issues bigger than herself. In interviews, she spoke passionately about the importance of standing up for your rights, even when the odds seem stacked against you. "This isn't just about me or my family," she said during one TV appearance. "It's about reminding people that their voices matter. Whether it's protecting your home, fighting for justice, or simply doing what's right, never underestimate the power of speaking up." She also made sure to honor her grandmother's memory every step of the way. Within weeks of the trial, Karoline organized a small gathering at the land itself. She invited neighbors, friends, and even some of the reporters who had covered her case. Together, they planted new trees along the property line, symbolic gestures of growth and renewal. As she stood there, shovel in hand, Karoline felt her grandmother's presence stronger than ever. It was as if the old woman was smiling down, proud of how far her granddaughter had come. But the impact of Karoline's journey extended far beyond her own life. Inspired by her story, others began stepping forward to share their struggles. A farmer from another state reached out, saying he'd been embroiled in a similar land dispute for years but had lost hope until hearing about Karoline's win. An elderly woman wrote to thank her, explaining that she'd always felt too intimidated to challenge a developer encroaching on her property. Karoline responded personally to each message, offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes even connecting them with resources she'd discovered during her own fight. Judge McAllister, too, found himself reflecting on the case long after it ended. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor, he surprised many when he agreed to speak at a legal conference about the importance of balancing law with empathy. "Justice isn't just about rules and regulations," he told the audience. "It's about understanding the human element, the emotions, the histories, the lives behind the cases we see." Miss Leavitt reminded me of that, and I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my career. Meanwhile, Karoline returned to her daily life. Though it wasn't quite the same as before, her community now looked at her with newfound admiration, often turning to her for guidance or support. At first, she worried she wouldn't live up to their expectations, but over time, she realized something important. She didn't have to be perfect. All she had to do was stay true to herself, to keep caring, keep helping, and keep fighting for what mattered. One evening, months after the trial, Karoline visited the land alone. The sun was setting, casting golden hues over the fields and trees. She walked slowly, running her fingers over the bark of the old oak tree her grandmother had loved so much. Sitting beneath its branches, she closed her eyes and let the quiet surround her. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel everything: the fear, the frustration, the triumph, and most of all, the gratitude. "I did it." "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I kept your dream alive." As tears welled up in her eyes, she imagined her grandmother sitting beside her, laughing softly and patting her hand. "You always knew I could," Karoline added with a smile. That moment under the oak tree became a turning point for Karoline. She realized that while the trial had been a monumental chapter in her life, it wasn't the end of her story. There were still battles to fight, not necessarily in courtrooms, but in everyday acts of kindness, advocacy, and resilience. And she was ready. Years later, when people asked her what she'd learned from the experience, Karoline had a simple answer. Life is full of challenges, big and small. But if you stand firm in your beliefs, lean on the people who care about you, and never lose sight of why you're fighting, you'll find strength you didn't know you had. And sometimes, just sometimes, you'll change the world around you. Her words resonated with everyone who heard them, proof that one person's courage can inspire countless others. Karoline Leavitt may have started as an ordinary woman, but through grit, heart, and unwavering determination, she became extraordinary. And in doing so, she showed the world that justice isn't just handed down, it's fought for, earned, and cherished.